Of course, the idea of free will itself is eternally under scrutiny. Is it actually us that decide to do something? Where does the idea to do something actually come from? Do we decide to think of doing something before deciding to do it? How do we decide to think of doing that before deciding to do it? Think of a cat. Where did the idea to think of a cat come from? Me, right? But where did I take that idea from? Did I debate the decision to thinking of a cat? Or did I just think of it? Where did that thought come from? Try it. Next time you have a thought, should you be the kind of person to have thoughts, have a think about if you chose to have that thought or not. Then have a long, hard think about whether you have control over your thoughts. And this brings us into some really serious issues into question here. Because should somebody decide to rob a bank, we'd have to explore where the decision to decide to rob a bank arose. I mean, can we hold someone accountable for their decision to act on a thought that they can't explain the origin of? Can we, for certain, say that the person chose to think about robbing a bank before deciding to do it? Or did the idea just arise, as they often do? Of course, as far as the law is concerned, we have to act on, or punish that decision to act. But you have to think about how that person decided to rob the bank, and how did they decide that? It's a dilemma. An experiment was done into this way back in 1964, the results of which have fascinated us ever since. As humans, we like to think we have control over our fate, of course. 2 German scientists monitored the electrical activity of a dozen people's brains, and of course back then it was kind of like these, the sticky things on the head and an electrical readout on paper. 1964, like a shower cap, I guess, with you see them in the films. The participants sat in a chair, tucked neatly in a metal booth, all on their own, and they just had one task. Their task was to flex a finger on their right hand as often as they fancied, over and over, tapping the table, sometimes up to 500 times a visit. The idea was that they wanted to search for signals in the participant's brain that proceeded each time they decided to tap. And at that time, researchers knew how to measure brain activity that occurred in response to events out in the world. When they hear a song, for instance, or look at a photograph. But no one had figured out how to isolate the signs of someone's brain actually initiating an action, deciding to do something. What they found is that in the milliseconds leading up to the finger taps, the brain scan output showed like a wave of brain activity that arose for about a second, like a drum roll of firing neurons. And it ended in this abrupt crash and a tap of the finger. This flurry of neuron activity, which the scientists called Bereitschaftspotential or readiness potential, they believed was the brain getting ready to create a movement, a voluntary movement, tapping the finger. That's to say that the squiggly lines on the page were the brain deciding to make the decision to send a message to the finger to tap. 20 years later, psychologist Benjamin Libet used the Bereitschaftspotential idea to make the case that not only does the brain show signs of making a decision before the person acts, but incredibly, the brain starts working, the wheels start turning before the person even consciously decides to do it. The way he did this was that he repeated the experiment before, the finger tapping with the brain sensors. But he asked his participants to watch like a clock, a really accurate clock, with less than a second kind of measurements on it. And they could remember the moment that they realized they were making a decision. When they thought, I'm going to tap my finger now, they could say when it was. The results showed that while the Bereitschaftspotential started to rise about 500 milliseconds before the participants performed an action, they reported their decision to make that action only 150 milliseconds before. The brain evidently decides to do the movement before the person themselves consciously decides to, before they're even aware that a decision has taken place, Libet concluded. Suddenly, our choices, even just deciding to tap a finger, these all seem to be made for us before we even know a decision is being made. And perhaps there is something beyond us making choices on our behalf, and even if we do feel duped into having made these choices, is our brain acting for us before we even know that it's acting? To many scientists, it seemed implausible that our conscious awareness of a decision is just an illusionary afterthought. Researchers questioned Libet's experimental design, including the precision of the tools used to measure brain waves and the accuracy at which people could actually say that they were making a decision. But the flaws were hard to pin down, until 2010, when a researcher at the National Institute of Health and Medical Research in Paris, Aaron Schurger, who was gathering tons of data on the just general background activity of our brains, and he came up with another idea. Now, neuroscientists apparently know that people, to make any type of decision, our neurons need to gather evidence for each option. Much like we do if we're deciding to buy a car, for example. We might go online and look at different car reviews and decide on which car's the best one for us. Similarly, our neurons are gathering information on the various options to tap the finger, not to tap the finger, to tap the finger now, tap the finger later, I don't know. And the decision is reached when a group of neurons accumulates evidence past a certain threshold, a kind of tipping point. And much of this data is gathered from the outside world. For example, if we look out the window and see the grey skies, that is probably enough information to tip us into deciding to take our umbrella with us today because it might rain. But Libet's experiment, Schurger pointed out, provided its subjects with no such external cues. They just tapped their finger when they wanted to tap the finger. They acted whenever the moment struck them. These spontaneous moments, Schurger reasoned, must have coincided with a haphazard kind of ebb and flow of the participants' brain activity. Remember, Schurger had spent years just scanning people's brains, and he found that even when they're not doing anything, there's kind of peaks and troughs of brain activity. And so he says they would have been more likely to tap their fingers when their motor system happened to be closer to a threshold for a movement initiation, when the brain neuron activity had peaked before it troughed. So what Libet thought was the brain making a decision to decide to tap the finger was actually just the background noise, the peaks and troughs of neuron activity that are always going on in our brain anyway. And instead of people's brains deciding to move their fingers before they knew it, as Libet thought, what Schurger thinks happened was it actually meant that this noise in people's brains sometimes happened to tip the scale, because there was nothing else to base the choice on. And that saved us from this endless indecision when forced with an arbitrary task. Schurger and two Princeton researchers repeated a version of the experiment. To avoid unintentionally cherry-picking brain noise, they included a control condition at which people didn't move at all, so they could still register the brainwaves peaking and troughing, if you like. An artificial intelligence classifier allowed them to find at what point brain activity in the two conditions diverged. If Libet was right, that should have happened at about 500 milliseconds before the movement. But the algorithm couldn't tell any difference until about 150 milliseconds, which, remember before, was when participants reported they knew they were going to move. In other words, people's subjective experience of a decision, what Libet's study seemed to suggest was just an illusion, appeared to match the actual moment that their brain showed them making a decision. Whilst all of these are just theories, astrophysicist Sean Carroll points out that people who question the existence of free will don't have any trouble making choices. John Searle has joked that people who deny free will when ordering at a restaurant should just say, "Just bring me whatever the laws of nature have determined I will get." In his book, The Big Picture, Carroll talks about the philosopher Daniel Dennett, who coined the term Cartesian theatre, which is to describe the supposed mental control room of a tiny people who gather in all the input from our sensory organs and access our memories and send instructions to the various parts of our bodies and make our decisions for us, much like in the film Inside Out. Whilst Carroll presents several physics-based theories about free will, all the way down to the microscopic idea of determinism, in which he says that the universe has to function within strict quantum physics rules and everything is already determined, or at least the limit of the number of things that could possibly happen is decided. And he talks about Laplace's demon, which was a theory by Laplace in the 1800s, where a person or a demon who knows the precise location and momentum of every atom in the universe, their past and future values for any given time, are entailed. They could calculate, using the laws of science and physics, exactly what could happen next. Of course, as Carroll points out, that's all very microscopic. We can't do that. It has no real impact on us, because we can't know the exact location and momentum of every atom in the universe. And therefore, who cares? What we are trying to do is construct an effective understanding of human beings, not of electrons and nuclei. Given our lack of complete microscopic information, the question we should be asking is, does the best theory of human beings include an element of free choice? Carroll concludes that thinking of the collections of atoms we call people as rational agents capable of making choices seems to be a pretty good theory. And one likely to remain useful for a long time to come, or at least That's what he chooses to think, and I think we should too. It's important to remember that physicists, philosophers, neurosurgeons, psychologists, many people are working hard to prove that we have free will. Whether we have it or not, at least if we believe we have it, it's just fair to us to recognize the decisions and choices that we do have control over. And perhaps it'll just make us feel a little bit happier.